I think we reached a critical mass here, so why don't we get started? Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Got waves, thumbs up, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today to the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District and Alameda County Resource Conservation District's Regional Priority Plan meetings. This is actually stakeholder meeting number 2. So welcome, everybody. I just wanted to start off our day with an acknowledgement that I'm currently on land taken from Karkin and Bay Miwok Indigenous peoples, and I strive to continue in their traditions of sustainability, stewardship, and living in harmony with nature. Thanks, Canyon, for throwing that into the chat. If folks want to join in and say what land and watersheds they're currently in right now, and join in on that, please feel free to do in the chat. And then let's go ahead and introduce the RPP, the Regional Priority Plan team, and the good folks who have been working on this a lot. So again, I'm Chris. I'm the Executive Director with the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. How about if I pass it to Ben?
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Weiss. I'm the Ag Conservation Manager here at Contra Costa RCD, and I'll pass it to Hannah.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Lopez. I'm the Wildfire Conservation Coordinator and Fire Specialist at Contra Costa and Alameda RCDs. I'm currently speaking to you all from Costa and Grazing Lands on Berkeley.
Interesting.
Great.
Hi, I'm Catherine Boxer, CEO for the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, and we are in partnership on this project with Contra Costa.
And Barbara?
Hi everyone, I'm Barbara. I'm a project assistant at the Alameda County Resource Conservation District, and I'm calling in from Ohlone Land.
And then Carol?
Hi, I'm Carol. Good morning, Carol. Good morning. I'm Carol Rice with Wildland Resource Management, a fire management consulting firm. I'm supporting the RPP process and these wonderful RCDs in technical aspects of this.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I do want to have a special mention and thank you to our funders here at the DOC, providing money to the Coastal Conservancy to help run this program as well. So shout out to those folks and thank you very much for your support. Okay, we still have folks entering, which is good. Good to see folks just coming in. Okay. Since we do have a lot of folks on the call today, we do want to go over some quick Zoom protocols. It'd be great if folks can keep themselves muted, keep the chatter down and the side noises to a minimum. When we do pause for questions, or please feel free to use the raise hand function. Hopefully folks know where that is. And also, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit during the presentation, you're also welcome to put them into the chat and we'll try to answer them at the end. If we don't have a chance to answer those questions, we'll send them out answered on the listserv. And just a reminder, we are recording this presentation just for folks that aren't available to make it today, so we can share it with them. So here's our agenda for today. A quick welcome and then a recap of the first meeting. We'll go into an analysis of the existing conditions, so we have some good maps to go with that. We will dive in a little bit on what the potential priority projects could look like. So folks would be able to get their thoughts going on what that could be. We'll go into the core working group details and how those groups would work moving forward. And then we would end up with a summary and Q&A at the end. So that's where hopefully we can get to folks' questions. So yes, consider yourself all welcome. Thank you for being here. And I'll pass it quickly to Catherine. Oh, you're on mute, Catherine.
Good morning, and again, welcome to today's meeting. We really appreciate you taking time out of your days to join us. What I wanted to address this morning is, and this came up in our first meeting, and that is that the regional priority plan is a concept that was developed by the Department of Conservation, and the goals and objectives of the regional priority plan are to identify natural resources and wildlife and habitat related issues that need protection, or natural resources that need to be, say, grasslands grazed down more, or chaparral browsed back by goats. There's a lot of different alternatives. But the regional priority plan is in no way intended to supplant or substitute for existing jurisdictional CWPPs. And that had been a misunderstanding of at least some of the fire departments. I have spoken at length with the DOC, and we've involved CAL FIRE. We have their support 100%. And what our intention is that once the regional priority plan is completed, including details on identified projects and how they should be implemented, that plan, once approved, would become an annex to CWPPs in jurisdictions in Contra Costa and Alameda County. And the fire departments are, of course, integral to working with all the stakeholders as we identify projects in terms of various implementation strategies as well as priorities. So just wanted to clarify that. If anyone has other questions, you're certainly welcome to contact me directly. But thank you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Okay, so we have a PowerPoint for folks. I think it's pretty exciting, actually. I think it's a good PowerPoint, but why don't we continue? So just for the folks who are maybe new here and the folks, we can recap sort of the overarching ideas from the first meeting. But so what is a regional priority plan? I know Catherine touched a little bit on it, but we're looking to enhance the health and protection of natural resources and wildlife, as well as looking at where these places might also be affecting people as well. And so we really want to promote folks being collaborative and talking with each other and trying to integrate projects together. You know, you all are kind of our local experts on these, so we need your input and feedback on what would be good projects in your areas. And then, you know, the hope is to come out with a prioritization list of projects that would eventually be useful for folks when they're applying for additional funds. So I know when folks apply to funding, there's often a question of, you know, is there an overarching plan that mentions that this is a good idea or that these projects have already been identified and vetted? Hopefully this list is that process. So at the end, we'll come out with the documents. We'll have a comprehensive list of projects that are prioritized, and then that hopefully works well for people applying for additional funds for implementation. Okay. And we just wanted to reiterate all the folks that we have invited. A lot of you folks are here, so thank you again. I think we maybe have sent out, probably at this time, we've sent out multiple invitations to folks. We've sent out initial invitations to maybe like 150 folks, trying to get as many stakeholders as we can involved in this process. So these are just some of the folks that are here in the meeting with you. And hopefully coming together, we can come up with the best projects for our regions. Okay, so now I will pass it to Hannah to talk about the great maps that she's been working on.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today. So I'll be wrapping up this recap of our first stakeholder meeting by talking about the description of existing conditions that was presented. So we created a set of web maps to identify the spatial distribution of factors that influence wildfire in both of our counties. You might recall we showed you a number of maps that included information like legislative boundaries, vegetation, and habitat types, as well as analyses that were done by state and federal agencies and our RCDs. So these maps are still available to you all, as well as the data that went into these maps. Many of you gave some really wonderful feedback on our maps, and we cannot thank you enough for your input. The feedback really was instrumental in what I'm going to be talking about next, which is this analysis of existing conditions. The next slide, please. All right, so what is this analysis? What we are presenting today is an interpretation of the existing conditions in our area. So between our meeting in April and now, you all have given us feedback on topics and parts of the regional priority plan that interest you. And based on that information, we anticipated what analyses might be useful for you all. So this is really an attempt to identify areas, in addition to areas that you're already interested in, that are suitable for potential regional priority plan projects. And before we get any further, we would like to point out that these maps do not reflect the potential permitting or regulatory constraints that affect field mitigation work. These really are just to show potential areas. Next slide, please. So sources and process. Like I said, with your feedback, a lot of folks pointed out some holes in our data. You all expressed concerns about special status species habitat, crown fire potentials, and developing a grazed land layer. So we address this by using publicly available data sources, such as the Bay Area Green Print, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife databases, and land fire data to improve our own analyses. So in addition to analyzing these new data sets, we also interpreted a few analyses that were already completed by state and federal agencies. And while these analyses are really valuable to us, they don't always represent what's on the ground. So we also tried to identify gaps in these analyses that might not reflect the actual conditions in our counties. As Catherine mentioned, and I'd also like to point out that many of you are involved with or familiar with the Community Wildfire Protection Plans, or CWPPs. Community wildfire protection plans focus on protecting human and built resources. The regional priority plan complements these CWPPs by focusing on the protection of natural resources in wildland areas. That said, project areas might overlap in some cases between the two documents, such as in the wildland urban interface. However, we want to reiterate that these two documents are not in competition, and rather we believe they support each other in wildfire mitigation and planning. Finally, as we move along and get further into this presentation of the analyses, I'm going to ask you all to consider this question. So does this analysis give you the guidance that you would need to identify projects that would be beneficial to the region or are of interest to you and your specific agency? All right, so let's get started. Next slide, please. All right, pest and drought damage. So the first analysis we'll look at is coming from CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE created a statewide data set of priority landscapes in order to highlight areas where field reduction and restoration projects could occur. This first priority landscape we're looking at now focuses on areas for restoration of forest lands that have been damaged by pests and drought. So the Tree Mortality Task Force classified areas as either Tier 1 or Tier 2 high hazard zones. Tier 1 high hazard zones are areas where tree mortality directly coincides with critical infrastructure, so they represent direct threats. It's a little bit hard to see the Tier 1 areas on this map, but they're these small bright pink blobs across the East Bay Hills and a little bit further into the East Counties. The Tier 2 high hazard zones are watersheds that have significant tree mortality, as well as significant community and natural resource assets within them. So these priority landscapes were based on 2018 data. And while it's really helpful for us to know, for example, that southeastern Alameda County may have experienced or be experiencing high mortality events that might have contributed to the SCU fire complex, we do know that a lot has changed in 2008. And for example, we are seeing large mortality events in our aging forests. However, we don't have good maps for these new conditions that we are currently in. And when we are thinking about priority projects for the RPP, we can also think about the data gaps that exist in our region and how being able to map things like drought and pest damage areas on smaller scales can increase our understanding of regional wildfire hazards. So for example, this could be a project in the regional priority plan. Next slide, please. All right, ecosystem services at risk. This is another analysis provided by CAL FIRE Priority Landscapes. This priority landscape focuses on ecosystem services at risk, and it prioritizes watersheds for potential treatments. It ranks watersheds on a scale from 1 to 5, with rankings of 1 being areas of lowest risk. The ecosystem services that were considered here were surface water value, carbon storage, standing timber, site quality, and large trees. Threats to those ecosystem services were that were considered were fire threat and fire return interval departure as defined by CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service. When we're looking at these maps, we can see that areas with ecosystem services most at risk are in the eastern areas of our counties. These are predominantly grassland and rangeland areas. What this highlights for us is really the critical role that local ranchers play when it comes to the protection of natural resources with ecosystem services. We can also see that the upper Marsh Creek watershed and the Mount Diablo area are critical places for mitigation and protection. And finally, I'd like to point out that the San Leandro Creek watershed, which encompasses Lake Chabot, is a good example of how watersheds with important ecosystem services can also exist within our urban areas. If you could click next for me. So here is a zoomed in image of the Lake Chabot area, and we can see that there are many surface water resources that are within this watershed that extend into our bay. So this analysis might be useful for us in terms of being able to ID general areas that have high ecosystem functions and would be able to define these areas as priority areas for field treatments. All right, next slide, please. Communities at risk. So the final CAL FIRE priority landscape analysis we'll look at is this communities at risk. So even though we are focusing on natural resources, we recognize the importance of protecting our local communities. So this analysis prioritizes landscapes where communities, i.e. people and associated infrastructure, are at risk from wildfire. Again, the goal is to direct efforts at reducing wildfire risk in these areas. So CAL FIRE ranks areas at risk on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 again being areas of lower risk. To do this, they combined housing density data with the fire hazard severity zones they helped develop. So areas with red are areas with higher risk, areas in green are areas with lower risk. We also wanted to see how the CAL FIRE classifications of the wildland-urban interface, intermix, and influence zones correspond to these priority landscape rankings. So that's the pattern overlay that you're seeing on top of the colors. The hatched areas are being identified as the WUI zones. Basically what we found is that we can identify communities at risk in 2 ways, through priority landscape rankings and through identifying wildland-urban interface zones. The priority landscapes 3, 4, and 5 classifications strongly overlap with these areas identified as the WUI. Additionally, when we're looking at these high risk communities in the East Bay Hills, We can also see that this encompasses areas like the San Leandro Creek watershed, which we previously saw in the last slide, is an area with ecosystem services at risk as well. So this is really an example of how a specific landscape can incorporate areas with both communities at high risk and ecosystem values at high risk. So when we are planning projects, we really can design them to meet multiple objectives. And next slide, please. All right, so the next couple slides we'll be presenting are examples of data layers that we created based off of stakeholder input. This first one is for grazing lands. This is a layer of parcels in Alameda and Contra Costa counties that are either partially or fully grazed by cattle or goats. I'd really like to thank all the agencies that supported us and individual landowners that supported us in creating this map, especially Sheila Berry from UC Cooperative Extension for spearheading this project. So Cooperative Extension developed a vegetation layer from a variety of sources that showed all the grazed land layer across both counties. So we took that vegetation layer and we took parcel data and we determined which ownerships across both counties had at least 200 acres of grazable land within their jurisdiction. Our parcel data comes from Cal Lands, which is another UCANR project, and local county parcel data as well. We then did a lot of outreach to folks to determine which parcels were grazed either partially or in full. You might see areas where our data does not reflect your local knowledge, and we want to express that this is a working map that can be continuously updated. This is helpful for us in many ways. The first is it is helpful for us those of us who are interested in using strategic grazing as a fuel mitigation method. This is because grazing must be strategically managed in order to be an effective fire mitigation technique. It's also incredibly helpful for us because it allows the RCDs to update our fuel models for our fire behavior modeling. And that takes us to our next slide. Thanks. All right, high severity fire areas. So our RCDs really wanted to model fire behavior in our counties because we are trying to understand where areas of high severity fire potential exist in our region. We also wanted to show where areas of high severity overlap with other important factors like water quality and habitat. So fire severity is the impact that fire has on existing vegetation in an area. Areas with higher severity are areas where we see greater change in vegetation, which can negatively impact our natural resources. So where does this grazing layer come in? Our models initially assume that all grass vegetation in our area is ungrazed, and that can cause our model to overpredict areas that might be high severity fires. The grazing layer really allowed us to modify these models to better reflect the true fuel loads in our region. So after updating our models, this is the resulting layer. We believe this shows high severity fire potential in our counties. It's based off of 2018 land fire data. This layer combines areas with torching and crown fire potential with areas where flame lengths are greater than 8 feet. So high hazard conditions. The fire model was ran under extreme wildfire weather conditions for our area. And we just thought it was appropriate to describe these details, the details of this layer in full, because it really is the foundation for the other analysis I'll be presenting moving forward. The next slide, please. All right, so we took this high severity fire potential layer and overlaid it on other analyses to really identify where important natural and community resources might be impacted by high severity fire. The first layer we looked at, which is the layer on screen right now, is a data set of important surface drinking water created by the U.S. Forest Service. What this data set provides is an index of surface drinking water importance on a scale from 0 to 100. It uses 2005 housing development estimates, and it's on the subwatershed scale. So dark blue subwatersheds are areas that serve the most number of people. Red areas are areas with high severity fire. What this overlay is showing us is that every sub-region across both Alameda and Contra Costa counties has high severity fire potential within it. We also calculated the top 3 watersheds with the highest percentage of severity acreage within them. These are Upper Arroyo Mucho, Trout Creek Arroyo Valley, and Upper Corral Hollow Creek in southeastern Alameda County. However, we also see that watersheds like Upper Marsh Creek and Contra Costa County have really high importance index and also have large amounts of high severity fire potential within them. So prioritizing these landscapes for field mitigation might be important to folks who are interested in the impacts that high severity fire has on surface water quality in areas that serve large populations. And next slide, please. So streams and rivers and high severity fire areas. So with this analysis, we pivot to see how we can protect natural resources and riparian areas from fire. This map shows the length and miles of riparian areas that overlap with high severity fire potential. We defined riparian areas as a 250-foot buffer around any stream or river in the county that is recognized by the National Hydrology Dataset. So darker subwatersheds are areas with more miles and rivers, or with more miles, of streams and rivers that are potentially affected by high severity fire. And looking at the map, we can see that southeast Alameda County, the San Leandro Creek watershed, and the upper Marsh Creek subwatershed are all areas that have over 276 miles of streams and rivers within high severity fire areas. So this analysis can help us locate and justify projects along streams and rivers. Next slide, please. All right, vegetation and high severity fire. So this next analysis really tries to help us consider field treatment types based on vegetation. We understand that the type of treatment we might do in an area really depends on the vegetation cover type there. So we overlaid our high severity fire potential model on a CalVeg vegetation layer. If you could click next for me. All right, so areas with high severity fire potential that pop out, so these bright colors that are standing out, were identified to be grasslands, shrubs, hardwood forests, hardwood woodlands, and some conifer forests and woodlands. Next slide, please. Right, invasive species and high severity fire. A few stakeholders really expressed interest in using field reduction techniques to manage invasive species in our region. So just display the distribution of invasive species, we're using this aggregated data set. It's coming from the Cal Invasive Plant Council, and it shows the distribution of the 204 invasive plants in the CalIPC inventory. The data set was created from expert interviews that were conducted with land managers, as well as CalFlora data and the Consortium of California Areaceae data. So darker quadrants have larger amounts of invasive and non-native species, and the bright red areas are areas of high severity fire potential. We do recognize this as a very coarse data set, but this data can also be paired with more specific CalFlora data and local knowledge to best address the non-native species in the area. So this can justify or support projects, say in or around existing weed management areas that might be affected by high severity wildfire. And if there's interest, this is a map that we believe can easily turn into an interactive web map that shows exactly what invasive species are present per quadrant and whether they're managed or unmanaged. Next slide, please. Right. Biodiversity and high severity fire. So stakeholders also expressed an interest in identifying areas with critical habitat. These final two maps we're going to look at are coming from data that is produced by the CDFW, so the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. This data set is called Areas of Conservation Emphasis. The first data set from them we'll look at is the Species Biodiversity Summary. So this data set was released in 2018. It gathers spatial data on wildlife, vegetation, and habitats across the state. It uses multiple sources of species occurrence data, as well as using predictive species models. So the species biodiversity data set that we're looking at here combines 3 measures of biodiversity into a single metric. So the first measure is native species richness, which is the overall diversity of both common and rare native species in the state, as well as climate vulnerable species, important game, and important sport fish species. The second measure that they use is rare species richness, which represents the diversity of rare species in the region. And the last measure they use is irreplaceability, which highlights areas that support unique species of very limited ranges. So the data is ranked on a scale of 1 to 5. Areas of a ranking of 5 show areas with highest biodiversity. So that's those dark blue areas on the map. And again, the red represents high severity fire areas. All the polygons that are on this map are locations where biodiverse areas overlap with high severity fire potential areas. And since high severity fire may negatively impact more species in these dark areas, the rankings of 5, folks who are planning projects around the issues of biodiversity and habitat might prioritize these areas higher as a way to minimize high severity impacts on more species. A limitation of this data set is that it does not necessarily identify which species are present in each hexagon, but this data does include things like CNDDB occurrences or the California Natural Diversity Database occurrences, so it could be paired with alternative sources if people are interested in very specific species. The last map that we'll look at is again based off of, sorry, next slide, please. All right, the last map we're going to look at is again based off of that same California Department of Fish and Wildlife data set. This data, however, shows significant habitat, which is habitat that is the focus of state, national, or locally legislated conservation laws. It also takes into account significant habitat areas that are essential to the survival of very specific species of concern. Again, it's ranked on a scale from 1 to 5. The red areas are areas of high severity fire potential. Similar to the last map, all the polygons displayed here are locations where significant habitat overlaps with high severity fire areas. So coupling these significant habitat areas with areas of high biodiversity can further help us identify priority projects that look at issues of biodiversity and significant habitat. So this is the last map I have for you all. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm also happy to answer any questions about this at the end of our meeting here. And before we move on, we'd like to launch one quick Zoom poll to get some feedback from you all. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone should be getting a pop-up of this poll question. The first question is, if you do not already have projects in mind or are wanting to identify new project areas, did the analysis of existing conditions give you some guidance you would need to identify projects in your areas of interest? And then the second question is, would your organization better utilize a static map or an online interactive map that goes into detail about these analyses? And if anyone has any issues or needs troubleshooting for these polls, feel free to use the chat to let us know and we can try to work through it, or just put your answers on the chat as well. We're at about 55% participation rate. So if you are near the end of clicking through them, I'm gonna cut it off at 70. All right, seems like this is should be getting the results now. So it seems like this is really helpful for identifying projects, which is good to hear. And then it seems like the online interactive map would be a better template for our maps versus a static map, or both. Okay, so thank you for participating, and I'll hand it back to Hannah.
If we could go to the next slide, I think I'm now passing it off to Catherine.
Catherine, you're muted.
Thank you. You have certainly done a lot of work and over time quite enhanced these maps, and I anticipate as we all work together, we'll get even more critical detail. So I want to transition to discussing priority projects that we may develop and outcomes that we are looking for. First, I'd like to say that, of course, protecting and enhancing the biodiversity of this region is a very high priority concern. Resource management on natural landscapes is something that has not been addressed extensively on a collaborative basis. So we hope the RPP increases that collaboration, and in particular with agencies, with land, open space responsibilities, as well as fire agencies. More and more we're hearing about ecosystem services, and watersheds certainly are a key element of providing great water quality and high amounts of water, and managed properly will have better water retention in the ecosystem. We also want to ensure that we are protecting historical resources such as Indian artifacts, as well as old early mining towns. So with that, next slide, please. So we'd like you all to start thinking, which I'm sure you're doing already, about specific project types and the goals and objectives you wish to respectively respectively accomplish. So the objectives, the intent is that the projects identified are meant to really capture the wildfire mitigation needs of the region. Go ahead. So wanted to give you some examples of project objectives. We want to, from a natural resources management standpoint, ensure that sensitive and rare habitats are protected by reducing the likelihood of severe wildfire disturbances. So we want to do what we can to reduce vegetation succession, for example, from grasslands to scrublands. We prefer greatly to have open grassland habitat with, of course, native bunch grasses, and that then is wonderful habitat for multiple species of grassland birds. Okay. Certainly, we'll be reaching out to the public once we are further along with our planning work. And we want to share with the public best practices and natural resource strategies to protect habitat, species, livestock, etc., from fuels by, from fire by effective fuels management. So we'll be developing and distributing a education package on the benefits of various fuel treatments and encouraging, of course, that they be performed outside of bird nesting season. And you can see this beautiful Swainson hawk in the photo to your right. Go ahead. So the San Joaquin kit fox, the smallest canid species in North America, and really quite rarely sighted in Alameda and Contra Costa County, still exists in San Joaquin and Kern counties. And there is an opportunity by maintaining grasslands and appropriate shrub communities that while the kit fox is really struggling with landscape that is quite fragmented due to urban development as well as interstate highways, we want to see eventually that the kit fox is reintroduced into our counties. Therefore, we want to ensure that their habitats are available once introduction or reintroduction program is developed. Okay, next. So our biologist here at the RCD, Rika Stolting, just happens to be an expert in the Alameda whipsnake. It is a threatened species, both on the federal and state level, typically found in chaparral, coastal shrub, and coastal sage. It can utilize grassland habitat for mating, however, can be found in numerous habitats. The whipsnake range is mostly limited to Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and it does continue to be threatened by urban development. So areas that we are aware that the whipsnake is active will want to do what we can to protect those areas from wildfire. Next slide, please. I like this picture. Who could not? The burrowing owl. It's a wonderful creature. It is a species of special concern in California. I think, as most of you know, it's found in dry, open areas with not a lot of vegetation. And it's in areas where other animals, ground squirrels, etc., congregate, and that could be anything from grasslands, farmlands, rangelands, etc. What I learned recently, is that the large wind turbines, for example, over the Altamont Pass, they cause a great degree of ground vibration, not necessarily that we humans can perceive, but the burrowing owls certainly do. And so they essentially have moved off of habitat because of the location of the wind turbines. And of course, land development also causes them to relocate. And if urban development and urban growth boundaries continue to expand, there will be lesser and lesser numbers of burrowing owls. Okay, next, please. So I know there are, and I'm glad to see a number of water agency representatives participating today. We all know that many of our riparian corridors have numerous obstacles within the corridors, everything from down trees to invasive species like arundo. So one of the projects we recommend is that we get into those areas and appropriately treat and remove blockages, slope stabilization through replantings of appropriate native species is also recommended both prior to and after areas being burned. Next, please. So another important element of our RPP is to do what we can, and I think various stakeholders will have different ideas on how we can speed up project implementation. Certainly in some areas, we're going to have to get programmatic permits, such as in riparian corridors. We will recommend that more extensive grazing is employed and that techniques for managing grazing success, whether areas are underbrowsed or grazed or overbrowsed, etc., is going to be critical to reducing fire severity. And of course, browsing, it's great to see animals like goats brought in who will eat virtually anything. And they do a wonderful job of shoring back chaparral. So we want to, as we move forward, increase our local capacity and understanding of vegetation treatment programs as prescribed in environmental impact reports. Next, please. So I did just mention grazing and browsing. Wanted to re-emphasize what a critical tool they are at quite minimal expense. It's a tool both for public agencies and private ranchers and other landowners to use. And there are participants today that specialize in rangeland management. The ACRCD has been working with Larry Ford Consultants on grazing management on thousands and thousands of acres of land quite successfully. So I would certainly recommend that company's services. So next slide. Next and last is we want to see, if feasible, if fire outbreaks can be reasonably aligned with historical fires. So in achieving that, we would want to increase the frequency and amount of prescribed burning on the landscape, obviously in close coordination with fire agencies. And then we would like to, this is another step altogether, identify and provide funding to agencies capable of either conducting prescribed burns or even consider whether a prescribed burn association might be appropriate for this region. So with that, I thank you, and I'm going to be turning it over to Mr. Ben Weiss.
And sorry, not to step in here, we have one more poll question. So I'm gonna launch this poll. And if you could all participate, we have, the first question is, does your organization already have any project objectives or project types in mind that you would like to include in the RPP? And question 2, did you find these example projects helpful? All right, so most of you all have participated. I'll end the poll here and I can share the results. So it seems like these example projects were really helpful, and that there's a decent amount of people who have an idea of what these project objectives or project types look like. All right, thank you. And I'll hand it back to Ben.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Catherine, and everyone else that's presented already. My name is Ben Weiss, and I'm here to talk about kind of our next steps on the Regional Priority Plan development, specifically our core working groups. So as Catherine just talked about, we went over just a number of projects that we're starting to think about and could be included in a potential RPP. We are hoping to develop more of those projects from you through our core working groups. So in order to best capture that information, we're going to try a method here, not today, definitely in the future, but of establishing these core working groups. So we're hoping to create subsets of stakeholders that will provide guidance on potential projects, feedback, and comments on the project development portion of this plan. Really, we're looking for participation from the folks already on this call, those of you watching this later on YouTube or reading the emails. You know, we're trying to capture all forms of feedback in developing this project list because we want to get as much as we can in it, as Chris mentioned in the beginning, so that way, when it comes time to write some of these grants, maybe to fund these projects, we have them in our plan already. We've started to think about them. We've started to identify potential areas where, or obstacles that we can overcome ahead of time, or we recognize that we need to overcome. Really, we're just trying to get everything ready so that way it's ready to go when it's there. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what are we asking folks to do? Really nothing too drastic, I would say. We'll try to get out some background materials and agendas for the future working group meetings here relatively in advance for you guys, so you can sit on them, percolate a little bit, thinking, I hope already that hearing some of the example project types that Catherine just talked about, you've got some ideas forming in your heads already. Let those percolate. We'll get back to you at the next working group meeting here. Yeah, so we want to have those out to you so that you can review them ahead of time. And then also let us know if there's other materials that you might need to think about. We can do our best to find those or talk to experts to find those materials and hopefully round out the picture for you as we all develop these projects. And then who can participate and how to join. So really we're looking for any and everyone that has a stake in Alameda or Contra Costa County, working in these various agencies. If you're a member of the public, if you are a private landowner, We want your input because we want to develop a really comprehensive set of projects that can be included in this RPP. So we will be doing a core working group meeting here, I believe in kind of late July is when we're looking now. We're still waiting on some details to shake out. But then if you cannot make that meeting, we know that time is valuable. We do plan on recording the call. We'll have it on YouTube as well, or this one on YouTube, but you can also get feedback to us via email, via our survey forms that we'll have published. Really, we're trying to capture as much as we can from all sorts of ways. Next slide. Yeah, so right now we anticipate at least 3 core working group meetings between now and December 2021. Like I mentioned before, the first one we believe will be late July. We'll get that information to you as quickly as we can set it. And we are also planning to hold these meetings in person, assuming that everything stays good like it is. But we also plan to have core working group meetings in both Alameda and Contra Costa County, so that way we can cut down on commute for all you folks coming from everywhere. And then I'll get into a little bit more here on the next slide, but the way we're going to be facilitating this is it's going to be a mix of small group discussion and large group discussion. We think that by getting the opportunity to cross-pollinate across agencies, across subregions, across working group interests, that we're going to get a lot of good and valuable projects and really get a robust list together for this regional priority plan. I want to go on to the next slide. So one of the ways we're thinking about organizing this is by subregions. You can see this lovely map that Hannah put together for us. These are kind of the subregions that we have gerrymandered to really get what we think is going to be some of the best feedback. But if you have comments on this map, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. Nothing is set in stone. I did want to touch on here that we do have, agencies and groups that may be in more than one subregion. And more people can absolutely participate from your entity if they want to. We do want to, represent as many of these subregions as possible. Likewise, you can participate in multiple subregions if your agency is multi-subregional. We'll go on to the next slide. And then here's something that Catherine just kind of talked about, but here are our areas of interest that we internally have kind of started to piece together some projects or potential projects. And here's how we've kind of organized those under these 10 areas of interest. Not to say that this is the only 10 areas of interest or that everything is organized perfectly here. Again, if you have comments on these areas of interest, we're more than open to them. We love to hear from you. But really, this is just how we're trying to organize this at present. We think these kind of capture everything that we're looking to put into the regional priority plan. But if there is something glaringly missing, please let us know. We admit that our focus may be narrow and we're trying to get as many folks as we can and that you all have something to bring to the table. So we want to get as many people involved in this as possible. And with that,
Ben, this is Catherine. If I could just add a couple more comments here to enhance understanding. Earlier in our presentation, you saw another list of boxes that included various types of stakeholders, whether you're a special district, a fire agency, a water agency, fish and wildlife, a land trust, et cetera, et cetera. And that was how we initially looked at what entities, what stakeholders did we need to reach out to invite participation in the development of the regional priority plan. Then, as we thought about it further, Chris had the idea of breaking down into subregions so that those individuals with expertise in X, Y, and Z subregions can contribute comments on projects that are brought forth or bring forth projects themselves. So in the core working groups that we'll talking about more shortly, individuals can either have several representatives or could also go from subregion to subregion throughout the few hours of a core working group meeting. And that will be important for the sharing of ideas and reality checks on what we can and can't do. So taking our thoughts a step further, these are the subcategories that we think we most need to focus on. But as Ben said, it's highly likely we're missing a few. So we do look to hearing back from you, and that's all. Thanks, Ben.
Great. And so now we will be launching poll. So if we could go back into the last slide, that would be great. So we could see this, and I'll include this question. If you're interested in participating in a core working group, which geographic subregion does your agency fall under? If your agency's jurisdiction has more than one subregion, please select the one you are most interested in joining. And you can have multiple choices. All right, this looks like a good place to stop. So I'll end the polling and I'll share the results. It seems like this was a great way to subdivide these regions because we have pretty even participation among these. So thank you for participating. And then we're going to go into the next slide. This is question. If you are interested in participating in a core working group, which area of interest best aligns with your agency's mission and interests? So again, you can choose more than one. This is multiple choice. And then there's also a second question that is core working group meetings will be held in person at RCD offices in either Concord or Livermore. Considering traffic and distance, what day of the week and time would best be able for you to meet?
Also, this is Catherine. I'd like to clarify that we're not, Alameda and Contra Costa will not be meeting separately. For example, the first meeting may be at the RCD offices in Alameda County, and then the subsequent meeting would be at a site in Contra Costa County. So we're fair in terms of commuting commitments.
All right, and I'm going to wrap up this poll and share the results with everyone. So it seems like this would all be helpful in organizing our core group meetings, knowing what the interest levels are. And then the availability seems like it would also help in planning the future meetings. Okay, thank you for participating, and I'll hand it back to Ben.
Yeah, and I'll take a quick question here and just answer Rebecca Pollin's question. Is there a chance that some of these meetings could be a Zoom / in-person hybrid? And I will let you know, Rebecca, that we are thinking about that. We'll see what's possible given technology and the way that we decide to plan this, but that is something we are thinking about. And we will obviously have more information as that comes out. Yeah, so I think with that, I will turn it actually back to Chris to wrap us up.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for all the nice presentations. I just want to remind folks there will be a Q&A session at the end of these last few slides. So if you want to hold a question and ask it in, I guess, on Zoom, but if you also want to type it into the chat, we can do that as well. So just a summary and next steps moving forward. We took a look at the existing conditions. Thank you, Hannah. So those will be available to folks, and then we'll also look at doing it online, interactive. It looked like that's what people were most interested in. We looked at the objectives and the types of priority projects to hopefully get folks' minds going on that and thinking about, where they could fit in and what would work in their areas and what would work best. We talked about the core working group meetings, and we hope that folks are able to stay engaged with us and participate and be able to come up with some great projects, collaborating with other folks and stakeholders in these calls. Yeah, and then we'll work on the prioritization of these projects and identifying and planning both by geography and then by folks' interests. Next slide. All right. We do have a feedback form. If folks want to think about stuff a little bit more and then send us their feedback, please do that. We'll include a link to this in a follow-up email. I'm not sure if Hannah, are you going to throw it into the chat? But yeah, if anything, we'll have the same questions. If anybody didn't get a chance to answer, or maybe a little bit Zoom shy, please feel free to include it on this feedback form. And again, we hope you all found the presentations informative and clarifying. If you have any questions, here are emails that we can be reached at. So yes, thank you again for joining us in this process. Thank you for being attentive, and thank you for your future collaboration on the plan. And with all of yours help, we'll come out with something great at the end.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. I would also, for the edification of folks that do intend to participate in the core working group meetings, I just wanted to give you a verbal schematic of what the meetings would look like. We'll be in large rooms, and we'll have multiple tables set up, both by sub-region, and then we'll have what do you call them, the note cards for various areas of interest. And the team that's developing this plan, that whom you've all met now, we will be helping to facilitate and support the development of projects in the core working groups, and at intermittent times in our sessions, we will be asking representatives from each core working group to come forward and talk about the ideas they have, issues they've discussed to date, questions that have come up, so that there's kind of a continuous sharing and brainstorming. And we will by no means identifying what projects are the highest priority until later in our core group meetings. Rather, that's three meetings from now or more if necessary. But I just wanted to clarify what that would look like. And that is why I encourage you all to participate in person if it's at all possible. Thank you.
And
Yeah, great. Thanks, Catherine. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I wanted to offer a quick clarification too for Dina's comment. The sub-region approach to tackling wildfire risk reduction in our counties will leave out potential more wide-reaching landscape level solutions. That is something that we're just looking at the sub-region as a way to kind of organize ourselves. We're definitely going to be looking much broader at the landscape level and cross-county and trying to identify projects there. Likewise, with the areas of interest we focus, we're going to try to take on all of those and think about as those apply on a county basis and on a Alameda and Contra Costa basis. It's not our intention to silo anyone into, okay, you're only going to focus on East Contra Costa issues. We just want to make sure that we're gathering feedback from everyone in order to inform some of those more landscape level project planning and good stuff there.
Nice. Thanks, Ben.
Great. So we can look at some of the questions that were in the chat, or if you have one, you can raise your hand and we can call on you. So the first question is from Felix Radcliffe. He said you would be interested in learning more about how the livestock grazing maps were used to update the map of high fire severity areas. So Hannah, if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I sent Felix a message about that too, but basically it can get a little bit complicated in terms of how it changes the fire behavior. What we wanted to say is that our initial models really predicted all grasslands as having more extreme fire behavior than they might actually have in reality because these areas are grazed. So our hope is to develop some story maps that really dive into the details here about how fire behavior changes when you have an area that's grazed grassland versus ungrazed. Basically, the grazed grass, which is shorter grass, is going to have less extreme fire behavior than ungrazed grass.
Great, thank you, Hannah. And if there's any other questions, feel free again to put it in the chat or raise your hand. And I'll make sure to add everyone's email to our listserv if you're not already on it.
It looks like no raise. Oh, we got one. Hi, Carol. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to figure out, I'm like, where is that raised hand in Zoom? Carol Mahoney with Zone 7 Water Agency. I was just wondering, because I'm thinking about how to get projects in the hopper, right? So what would be the timeline? How do we get these in either our maintenance plans, because we'll have to include certain activities, like I'm thinking specifically about invasives removal. I'm thinking about agencies that might be groundwater sustainability agencies, right? Thinking about groundwater dependent ecosystems and maybe the management of those. How would we think about this in the time scale of getting things on CIPs or in maintenance permits with the regulatory agencies? What's the time frame, in other words, that you guys are thinking of to come up with these priority projects? Because I'm trying to figure out in my timing schedule, how am I going to figure out what your priorities are and incorporate those from these individual groups, right? So obviously the groups are going to be meeting between now and December, and I'm trying to figure out how would we manage to appropriately put these in our financial plans and permits.
Oh, Carol, this is Catherine. I will attempt to answer your question. The Coastal Conservancy has shared with us that it's their intent to review the projects submitted and the priorities that we as a whole group assign to projects, but there is not yet any guidance from the Coastal Conservancy in terms of how they will evaluate the projects, what funding might be available, and the process by which we would request funding. I think that there could be concerns about really grand scale, extensive projects in terms of cost. So I understand your question. I think it's very valid, but we clearly will be coordinating further with the Coastal Conservancy regarding the scope of funds available, and if there are certain types of projects that would or would not be considered. And I'm sorry, but that's all the information we have at this time. But a very good question.
Great, thank you. And then we also have another question from John Kaufman. So I will, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you. I'm primarily interested in the WUI and dealing with wildfire in that area, which is number 5, but it also extends to making plans and implementing plans for vegetation management, which includes numbers 6 and 7. And I'm wondering if one could think in terms of combining all of that together into one project.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is a very good question. It's not something that we have discussed. Again, I think we'll need clarification from the Coastal Conservancy on that, whether they want to approach some of the projects by consolidation of the type of project, and if so, how, we don't know how the Coastal Conservancy will rank the various projects that we submit. But it seems like a very reasonable idea that consolidation of certain types of projects make sense in terms of planning and use of resources and involvement of fire agencies, etc.
Great, thank you. And then on the chat, we also have a question from Nancy. So she says, outside of public lands, private rural landowners and residents will be the ones to protect natural resources. How do we reach and educate them on fuel and fire management and fire prevention and mitigation? Also noted that the homeowner packet would be very beneficial and would highly recommend neighborhood watch meetings. Can these be coordinated with the help of the fire safe councils, Alameda County Fire and CAL FIRE? So if anyone wants to take that question on.
I can say that we are intending to distribute educational materials. I cannot speak for Diablo Fire Safe Council or Oakland Fire Safe Council, and it is not within the scope of our RPP to go beyond the distribution of information to homeowners or ranch owners. However, those active ranchers like yourself certainly have direct links in to the RCD, and we would be happy to advise you and support you and ways that are feasible for us. And of course, NRCS has EQIP grant programs where, and I know that you all have integrated some of those programs at your properties, but in application for those programs, you can apply and work with NRCS and perhaps get additional livestock troughs placed on your property with underground lines from your water sources, as an example. So I think we are moving forward, need to collectively work with a number of agencies to see how the priority projects that are identified can best be addressed and by what entity.
And likewise,
And are you going to talk about,
I would add on to that, that could be a great project that you bring to our core working group as something that we could implement in the future. You know, some sort of expanded education program where we're trying to, or we're getting a greater reach to private landowners like yourself. So thanks for the question.
Great. And then we have another hand raised by Topher Bird. I don't know if you.
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Topher Bird. I'm the Wildfire Resilience Forester for the CAL FIRE Standing Fire Unit. I have two questions. One, I was hoping someone could elaborate on what the approval process will be for the plan. I know it'll have to go back up to the Coastal Conservancy and DOC, but I was just curious what that formal process would look like. And then I was also curious, will there be, or rather, I guess I'll explain, with other CWPPs, we've had issues in the past with members of the public taking recommended actions as mandates. So I was just curious, will the projects, the priority projects that are included in the RPP be framed as recommendations only, or will you also be soliciting commitments from the various stakeholder groups? Thank you.
This is Catherine again. I would not see priority projects being identified as mandates. I would genuinely expect the fire agencies to be integral to the process of identifying the highest priority projects. But there has been nothing that I'm aware of to date that has been provided as guidance by the Coastal Conservancy regarding the approval process, or how they will, we'll present projects, we'll do our best in ranking them, but we've not yet been informed how the Coastal Conservancy will review our submittals and how they will determine final priorities and how they might be funded. So I'm sorry, but that's all we know at this juncture.
Great. And Lawrence will reach out to you regarding the information that you have on project work. And Rebecca will be also emailing the entire listserv with an answer to that question. But as we're wrapping up on time, we want to be respectful. So I'll hand it off to Chris or Catherine for closing.
Yeah, sure. Real quick. So retired Contra Costa County, and I'm on the Dallas Fire Safety Council as an advisor. And recently, a year ago, the Briones community where I live started the Briones Community Emergency Preparedness Group. And we're working from this guide that we got from Contra Costa County Wildfire Preparedness and Evacuation. And the area I represent with the Dallas Fire Safety Council is this Briones Hills Agricultural Preservation Area. And we're specifically right in the center of it. So we've had some WUI work done, or defensible space work done with Dallas Fire Safety Council. Right now it's the evacuation routes, and they've been overgrown due to extended drought, public work, Contra Costa County Public Works, deferred maintenance, probably due to the work shortage or employee shortage. And it's been a sticking point because much of the evacuation route through Bear Creek Road in the populated area, sparsely populated area, is adjacent to the creek. So that's a great, I think it's applicable to the work you guys are doing, since it specifically addresses creeks, as well as Pinole Creek watershed and agricultural grazing lands all around it. So I'll make sure and get it to the email you presented and include this information. And the community's been asking about getting work done on the evacuation, which also includes access for first responders coming in. So hopefully get included in the process. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lawrence. Yeah, just to be respectful of folks' time, we're a minute over, but thank you everybody so much for joining us today. And we hope that you all can stay engaged with us and continue in the process. And we look forward to seeing folks in person, hopefully next time. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes,
And
thank
keep
you.
an eye out for the email.
Thank you.